The date is October 16th. It is a Monday. Today we are going to be going over more or less a text that David has received from one of his friends, coworker, I believe, at one point or time or another.
Former coworker, but he's a student at Texas A&M.
And he got a textbook. It's entitled "Keeping the Republic, Power and Citizenship in American Politics." The 10th edition. He had shared with us. It's either the foreword or introduction or something like that. And it struck David as being biased, and then certainly the rest of us had opinions too about the text, and so we just thought we'd kind of discuss that as once again a way to kind of grind out what our beliefs are, what our thoughts are, at least anyways, and just really kind of getting us to think more about where are these thoughts coming from, and if there's any ground to stand on really with them. But once again, just really trying to get into what our politics individually are and how we can kind of come together to talk about them and move forward ultimately. So that is today's topic. Does anyone want to start with some kind of opening thoughts themselves, or shall we just dive into the text?
Dive into it, or whatever.
I'll say the reason I thought that this was interesting is it's always been interesting to me how and Bryant being the token liberal here, I'd be interested to know if he agrees with this, but it's always seemed interesting to me that a lot of the media is very left leaning. Universities are notoriously left leaning. And I even remember in high school taking like a history course and it having clearly like there was, there were more liberal values. And I've always wondered why that is. But I think it's something that everybody just understands for whatever reason. And we can get into why maybe that's the case. But this was just so over the top to me. It was just like it looked at the Republican Party. I think it specifically mentions the Republican Party, but anybody of conservative thought to be the enemy. That's how this is phrased. That's how I interpret it. And to me, that is a very dangerous thing to do, because I felt like through this, they were misrepresenting. They were saying things about a certain chunk of the American public that if one of those people were here, they would say that is not my viewpoint. This is not how I see it. And the example I used over text is I feel like this would be the same thing as a conservative saying, it's like saying Barack Obama is a communist. To me, it's very similar to that. It just feels like, I'll say this, to me, it's very wildly inappropriate to put this in a state of, a state university like Texas A&M. So that's why I decided to send it and felt like it'd be an interesting thing to discuss.
All right,
well, I feel it's kind of ironic, the bias that you take. I mean, it's just a natural part of life. But because you talked about how this can't be in like schools or whatever, or the state thing, but you've also mentioned that you're a big fan of freedom of speech. So yeah. With that, and you guys talk about like Tucker Carlson a lot, and he's like, in my eyes, he's a propagandist, and that's all he is. He just spews stochastic terrorism, and he goes off and says, well, he'll say go after them, but he says, this is bad, this is destroying your way of life, this is hurting you, So I feel like it's a very similar parallel, but he gets to a broader cast or a wider group of people because he's on prime time and people are just sucked into it. So I feel that you're already having a bias because you've been watching, in that echo chamber, not necessarily like constantly, but I feel like you've seen that more and you gravitate more to that side of the spectrum when watching news and everything. So you'll get that more, and you see that where there's a lot of, they're going after our country. Like, this is not how we're supposed to be. And he actually talks about that in there. So, I mean, I think it's just kind of I see what you're mad at, but that's exactly what people are mad at for stuff that comes on like Fox News and all these other big conservative outlets.
Okay, so I don't watch Tucker Carlson. I like him, but I haven't watched too much of him. But my thought isn't that they shouldn't be available. My thought primarily was, in fact, I'll read something from, it's the fourth to last paragraph in here. It says, classical liberalism, which underpins both modern liberalism and modern conservative thought, owes its existence to the free exchange of ideas. And like science carries within itself, by definition, the obligation to entertain threatens its own existence. And it goes on. But I'll say the difference between watching something on Fox News or MSNBC or wherever is because you're going to that.
Well, you're choosing to go to this school.
That's true. But if it's a state school like this, my problem isn't saying, hey, this is, I don't even have a problem with necessarily a professor saying I believe X, Y, and Z. I don't know that you can even avoid that. My problem with this is how, and if we're going to go down this, we probably are going to need to find some examples, but my issue with it is, like I said before, you're saying these people actively want to keep minorities down. I'm paraphrasing, but we can go through here and find it. And if you were to talk to somebody on the right, I lean right. I think Eric is more of a mainstream or Republican. Mainstream is maybe not the right word. You correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that that's a misrepresentation of the other side. And I'm enrolled in college right now. And I'll give you an example. We were talking about Black Lives Matter. And one of the things I appreciated was they were saying some people saw it as a protest, some people saw it as a riot. How you interpret that is dependent on your political values and how you went into that information. I know, I'm not naive. I understand that, a teacher is going to have their own way of looking at it, but I think just blatantly misrepresenting a whole chunk of the American public only exacerbates the problem that we already have of being divided.
Well, I think part of that is that you're reading into it so much that you think it's attacking that specific one side. What was I going to say? I forgot what I was going to say, but I lost my train of thought.
No, I like that you kind of brought that up, though, because I remember going to, I think it was the DMA, or maybe it was, I guess it would have been the DMA, but it was some kind of exhibit they had, and one of the pieces was basically a text, and I don't remember who wrote the text or even who the artist was, but basically it was a canvas and it was text, and it was basically someone highlighting, underlining, circling all of the bad things about the text, like how racist it was or how bigoted it was or something like that. And that's all I could think of is when I saw that, I was just like, you were like, I feel like you're really reading way too much into that paragraph or whatever it was. Because as I was reading it, it didn't say anything about like the N-word and like keeping down minorities. It seemed like a very bland text to me, but just like, I guess like the implications they were getting from reading it came across that way. So I think it's an interesting point, Brian, I would say.
Well, with that, I think, oh my gosh, I'm just keep losing my thing. You see that a lot in general, like that's religion in a nutshell, like people read the Bible and they're going to interpret it like there are 30,000 different sects of Christianity. So there's literally, without someone telling you exactly how to read that, everyone's going to have their own mind of what's right, how it's interpreted. So sure. That's just kind of the natural way the mind processes things. It can be created by environment or nurtured, so into you. But I think that's just there's no way around that. You know, you're just gonna. That's like why it's hard to do an eyewitness because everyone can see something happen, and you come back and ask them questions later, and you know they're not all going to say the same thing because they're focusing on something different and there's something else going on. So you're just naturally going to gravitate to having your inflection on what you're reading, like, you know, with how you are in your mind frame at that point in time.
Yeah. And then another thing I would point out what David had mentioned, and I guess kind of what you both went back and forth a little bit on as far as like what's appropriate in the classroom. I know for me, like my perspective on it has been, I guess because I had a philosophy teacher when I was a brief amount of college, and he made a point to say, like, I'm never going to, attempt to, like, give you an idea of what my personal beliefs in politics are. Like, my job as a teacher is just to give you all the different sides and angles of an argument and let the discussion happen. You guys can make your own decisions. So I could see from that perspective, I appreciate that, but I do think you make a good point in the sense of like free speech is obviously what we're fighting for. So like, what is that fine line between like we shouldn't be, potentially? I feel like this is maybe a little bit too hardcore to say, but like manipulating kids' minds into believing a certain ideology versus we need free speech in the classroom. So
that's just how. Before I was just going to say, I mean, I feel like that's just a natural way of things. Like whoever wins the war gets to write history. So you're always going to be told by whoever wants that process or whatever. There's always going to be a certain part of that. It's how you structure your society or something. It's how we've worked together. I feel like there's always going to be a natural part of that that's going to happen.
I'm trying to. The one thing we fucked up here with is. Because I'm trying to read this as well as listening to y'all. This is like
that's not going to be good.
A little mental, but I have to because we're talking about interpretation, like it's the Bible. The thing is that this isn't just some vague text that's saying something that can be up for interpretation. Some of it is obviously it's very long, but there's they are saying what they're not letting other people speak for themselves. And that's the issue I have with it. They're actively saying that white Christian Southern people, they feel like they're now the minorities because they have to share their rights with minorities. And I believe that there are racists everywhere. That's obviously true. I think that America is one of the least racist countries. But I think that is a talking point. That's a thing that people say. I think, honestly, I think a lot of the people that say stuff like this, and I live with a lot of them up in Portland, one thing I realized, I was like, oh, you never even met a Republican. You think anybody that votes red is racist. And they actually believe that. But I don't feel the thing that is inappropriate to me is I don't think you can just accuse half the country of being racist and hating minorities and wanting to keep gay people down because of they're not even saying it, just because of who they voted for. I mean, I think that both sides are guilty of this, but I'm guilty of it, I'm sure, putting words in other people's mouths. And I don't have a problem with a professor saying, hey, this is what I believe. But I think that when you're saying, it could be considered an outright lie. If I said, again, I'll use the example. If I were to say, 50% or however much, whatever percentage of California votes blue, those people want communism. That would be an outrageous thing to say, and people on the right say that. That's my thing is it's basically the inverse of that, saying, if you vote red, you're racist and you want to keep people down. It's like, that's not a healthy thing to say. And in my opinion, it's inappropriate.
Well, see, I think where that comes from is that you see a lot of this repression of these minorities, like be it taking away places to vote, destroying or making these special gerrymandered areas and purposely going so you don't get that. You're basically picking your voters. So you see, I see it's a lot of action. What is it? Actions speak louder than words, and so you see a lot of the Republican, which is mainly white Christian. So you take that, and since they're the ones making the laws, it's just naturally going to gravitate. Well, that's what it is, and if you keep voting for that, you feel like you're a product of what you vote for. So I think a lot of that stems from, you see that with a lot of these Republicans that are doing this, because I pull up this great quote that it says, if conservatives become convinced that they cannot win democratically, they will not abandon conservatism. They will reject democracy. And you can see that with these, like they're wanting to make it so they have a harder time to vote and just making things harder in general. So I can see why would they gravitate to that answer? Why would they say that? Because it's pretty much it's these old white Christians in these power that are doing all these things. Like, look at the percentage of the Congress, and that just kind of speaks for itself.
I think that what you just described speaks to politics in general, and I don't know necessarily. Well, I'll address a couple things, like the gerrymandering. So I don't even know if I disagree with you on that. I think that there's some of that is a little, like the one that happened. This isn't necessarily racially, although it could have been. When was it? When it was it Al Gore? The I demand a recount. Was it 2000?
Yeah, it was a 2000 election.
2000.
Yeah. That the Supreme Court decided the outcome of the election.
Yeah, I remember meeting, and this is completely anecdotal. I don't have any real evidence of this, but I remember meeting a guy in AA who was a lawyer, actually, coincidentally, and he claimed to know somebody that worked or owned a construction company in Florida. It was Florida, wasn't it?
Yes.
That happened at the state,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. And he said that they would purposefully do what?
The Chads or whatever they're called.
Pips. Were the Chads or Pips? I can't remember what it was called. Yeah, the Chads, like the indention on the ballot.
Yeah, that you punch
He was claiming that they purposefully fucked up construction so that people in minority counties would have trouble getting to the voting booths. So I don't I hear some of that too, and that stuff is as inappropriate as anything, in my opinion. I think that
that's just been a part of American history. It just hasn't changed. It's still there. You just don't notice it as much. But it's always been there.
My issue, I'm not saying none of that stuff happens. I think racism happens. I think racism happens on the left more than it does anywhere now. I mean, I think that the phrase "the bigotry of low expectations" is one of the most racist things I've ever seen, and I see it everywhere up here. This idea that you can't get an ID because you're black. I mean, to me, I don't want to go down this road too much because we're trying to read people's minds, but this idea that because we have to expect less of people that are minorities. I mean, to me, that's very racist. But I only say that because we could play this game all day of the right does this, the left does this, blah, blah, blah. But again, just going back to the original thing, this text right here, and this is probably everywhere. The basic sentiment of this is probably everywhere, but you're saying that people that vote this way believe this. And again, I mean, I think that you're putting words in people's mouths.
I don't know. Not that they believe that. It says that it's a general representation of the beliefs, because you're voting for this, and the people in charge have these actions. So that's you see it as a reflection of their area and their demographics of who they're voting for. So it's why it comes to this broad generalization of that idea where it's they're all like that.
Do you think that that's exclusive to the right?
No.
So do you think then it's a mischaracterization to say this about half the country when forgetting one side?
Well, I mean, how do we know it's really half the population? There's...
Well, I don't. I'm
so...
To make this simple, that's how I'm phrasing it.
Yeah. So I don't think you can. I think that's too overgeneralized, and I think what it's happening is that it's very. I don't know. It's reading into. It's just a bias. You see this as it's kind of attacking you. Well, how can they describe this whole half of this? Like, this is kind of like what I believe, and so they're generally putting me in this broad spectrum with these. So I don't. So
Jon Stewart made this point that I meant to send it to the group chat, actually, and I forgot. It was after Trump got elected. And I have it saved on my phone. I just forgot to send it to y'all, but I can if you're interested. It was after Trump got elected. And he made a very interesting point. Everybody knows that Jon Stewart's a liberal, a very fervent liberal. He's a good American. I believe that his heart is in the right place, even when I disagree with him. But he was saying, that on the left, they hate, I think the word he used was monolith. They hate, getting rid of nuance and saying that everybody is this one thing. But he was saying, but that's what we're doing. Saying we, as in that's part of his side. He goes, that's what we're doing with Trump supporters. He goes, I have very good friends that voted for Trump, and they didn't do it because they were racist. They did it because they wanted to keep their health insurance. And I think that the biggest problem in this country, just objectively speaking, is probably the fact that we're so divided. And I've never voted Democrat, but I was willing to vote for Tulsi Gabbard, for instance, because I felt like she was a centrist who, I disagree with her on a lot, but I like the idea that you could have somebody that could reach across the aisle and shake their hand. I think that that's a big deal. And I think that I know you guys live in Texas. I've definitely met most of the people that I've met that meet this, the demographic of the white Christian conservative, very few of them are racist at all. I mean, I don't think that is a fair, I'll use that word. I don't think it's a fair characterization of just, and again, I'm going to say half the country, but I hope you know what I mean by that. I'm not saying exactly 50%, but I think that it's just an unfair characterization. And again, just to use the,
I don't think it's because there's a big chunk of that, that side of the party that has those beliefs. You can see it in interviews, but yours is very anecdotal, mine is very anecdotal. So, but I do see that that's it might not be the half, but a good majority of that half feels that way. That might not even be half, but it could even be 35% of it, where everything has these other ones, but it's still and when you're looking at majorities, that's how that works. Just because it's not 50% of that side of the party, it's still a good chunk of the majority of the party. So I feel like there's this, you're having this bias, then, or you're putting it where it has to be this certain way. It's it's exactly 50% of this, or but if we think a majority, I think there's so many people, so there's such a small, so you don't have to have 100% or 50%. You can have all these different, just how fractions and shit work. So I feel even it could still be the majority, even though it's not 50% or half the people.
Do we have the quote that we're arguing about here? What's the quote from the text that we keep talking about right now? Do you have it, David?
Well, okay, so let me tell you, it's oh shit, it's a lot. Okay, I'm going to tell you how many. I thought it was closer to the bottom. This is too big. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I think it's 22 paragraphs from the bottom. It's basically saying this is why we should have probably not gone over, or we probably should have gone over this, but from the perspective of many white Christian, Southern, rural, working class Americans, those who would dethrone them or at least require that they share their thrones seem to have been telling them that they had been demoted, that they were now marginalized. They were now the marginalized ones, because they weren't any longer the ones who defined what it meant to be American. I mean, that's just...
Well, many doesn't mean half. Many just means a lot of them. That's so there's... I mean, that's just a way to talk about...
You wouldn't phrase that way. if you were just talking about a small chunk of people. I mean, they're clearly, in the context of this, they're clearly trying to, they're othering the other part of the country. And I guess that's my point.
I don't see that from that. I don't see the whole, I see like there's a certain group of people that truly believe that, and that's not a small part. It's many. It's a very variety. I just think the way we're reading it is different, and that's probably something we're going to have to agree to disagree on. But I don't see that as it says many white Christian Southern rural. It's like, so that's just a good chunk of them. Doesn't mean like half. Doesn't mean it's just there's a lot of them that do believe this. It's just like this is one. It was just easier to talk about this one part, this section, this ideology in this thing, because there's just so many vast different things that he could reference to get you an understanding to where he's going with in the thought of the opening to this textbook.
I want to read just the last little bit of that paragraph too. It's for context, it's talking about any type of activist for a minority group as enemies of their way of life, a way of life that they had been guaranteed to them by the U.S. Constitution was now under existential threat. They're talking about basically white Christian people are feeling like because of these other groups and because of their growth, they're the stereotypical white Christian American. They are under existential threat. Their way of life is under existential threat. So we can agree to disagree on that. But if this was reversed and they were talking about how, if it was from a right-wing perspective and they were saying things like, the left sees minorities as children, as little pets, and that's why they treat them a certain way, and that's why they tell them, they try to put handicaps on how they have to live their life because they see them as less than, because it can be interpreted that way. I would still be like, dude, you can't say that. You can't, just put words in other people's mouths. And just for the record, I do understand that there's going to be a bias in everything. That's just how it goes. It's just so in your face. But Eric, you haven't said anything. Eric, I'm curious what you think.
A number of thoughts for sure. I think it's I guess like I brought up before, there is like the freedom of speech question, but there is also hiding your perspective, because in my idea, the idea of college is to be met with a lot of abrasive ideas. So I guess you could argue that this is just an abrasive idea ultimately, but yeah, I can understand that there obviously is liberal versus conservative in a sense of there is this foundational belief of a liberal and a foundational belief of a conservative. So you're lumping in those foundations to kind of better explain what's happening. I don't know. I don't think it's particularly helpful to do it that way, but I think it certainly it gets a certain job done that I don't know if it's a good job, I guess. So I think you do need to keep within. I feel like I'm just talking my ass right now, ultimately. But I do think you just need to stick with the nuance of certain things, because when it comes to Republic, I guess what David was kind of saying, it's these people aren't. It's usually table issues, right? Is what they always say in the media is what people are voting for when it comes to a president. It's table issues. So it's just who is going to be the person left or right that's going to actually be helping you and you be afford groceries and have a better job and stuff like that. So I think that's also why you hear too it's the independents that are the ones that sway the election. You had what all this talk about the there's a lot of people that voted for Obama that voted for Trump as well. So then we talk about this idea that all the Trump voters are racist doesn't really fly with that idea, but I think speaks towards the power of the independent that's not really catering to either party. They're independent. They're just well, who's going to better serve me in my current need, ultimately? And I think that's more where the country's at, because if you have half the country doesn't even vote to begin with, and then the other half does vote, I don't know if Republicans and Democrats and independents, which is larger of those three, or if they're more or less equal in size. But it seems to me that's what I hear a lot from pundits and from the news. It's just the independents are going to sway the vote. So
I think that That's a good point. That half the country doesn't vote. That's a good point to make. I think again. I mean, I think that the one criticism that universities get now, while they get several of them, but one of the big ones is that it is no longer a place where you can have ideas, and excuse me, that's why there's a bunch of smaller colleges popping up, and I wish them luck. I hope that they're able to get accredited, because you can't really challenge liberal views in college. It's sort of their reputation now.
How so? I feel like that's essentially pretty much. Well, no, you can challenge it. That's the whole point. Like, just because it's in the textbook doesn't mean it's like
law.
Like,
well,
you go in there and you talk about it, and it's a talking point. So
professors that get fired.
Well, I mean, there's
that can't make tenure because of their political views, because they talk about their political views.
I mean, you can do that. That happened in the past too. Look at the people who are very left that lost their jobs for that. Over speaking out
today,
that.
I mean, we could look up.
But that's the thing, and that's where you see before it was mainly focused on the left, and so that's why the white conservative didn't have a problem. Now that it's like, oh wait, so my thing is not always in charge now, so that's this fear that that they're talking about. But I really think this paragraph is really pertaining to the talking about the riot, because it wasn't a lot of the white Christians, but many of them, the ones that have the riot, they were told like this was stolen from us. This paragraph, the January 6th, I think this paragraph is referencing, it's talking about January 6th, because it was from the perspective of many whites, which were many white Southern morals, which were there. It's just making the general working class Americans, that's talking about that paragraph in general, talking about the specific riot is where I gravitate to what this is really talking about. So those specific ones, they were like, well, our way of life is being attacked. There are a lot of people like Civil War 2.0 and all this. They really believe that because they thought the threat of their livelihood was being destroyed, and it was forced and just...
Well, that's the question though too. Is like, asking like how much is the Republican Party owned by that person that was there that day? It's the same as like how much is the Democratic Party owned by the BLM, writers or whatever, So it's just like, is it really just a fringe thing? Because I mean, I feel like I've noticed. Well, this certainly could just be my biases and echo chambers, but what I've seen of notice is Biden kind of stepping back from being like, the Republican is not your father's Republican Party, it's the MAGA Party. And I feel like he stepped back, and like even on the 60-minute interview he just did Sunday, he said 30% of the Republican Party is MAGA. And then you had the speaker vote where he was ousted, and it wasn't by a majority of the Republicans, it was by, 6 people? So, it's just like, I guess the question is, how many are these, like, I mean, even Jim Jordan, who was considered like a huge MAGA person, like one of the best beloved, representatives by Trump, and he didn't, vote for that to happen. So I guess that's more the question too, is just like, what are we sticking to a large lump of people? Is it just, the fringes of it, or, and it confusing that for the whole, I guess?
I think that's, and I'm guilty of this too. In fact, Eric, you've pointed this out, that maybe it's because of where I live. I do believe, I guess this could be like, I do believe that some of what's coming from the left is very dangerous, especially when we get into the thing about kids, for instance. That stuff scares the hell out of me. But I would feel equally uncomfortable with this if it framed all of the left as wanting to turn everybody into, convert everybody's kids into trans kids, for instance.
Well, I think what you're driving at, David, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like this is like one of the conversations, right? Is that, okay, so yes, this did happen in the past. It was the reversal of what is happening now is the argument. But a big argument is just like, well, is that really the direction that we want, is to just like, well, now it's our turn to be in charge and be the bigoted, opposed to just like, aren't we all trying to get past this in general, opposed to like saying now it's my turn to be shitty? Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yes and no. Sort of. That the end point there, yeah. I mean, I don't. My point is just that in general, like, you can't have. You just can't have a cohesive society when we're talking to each other like this. When we're talking to each other like the enemy, whether you disagree with them or not. And I think that when you make, just generalized statements about a whole chunk of people, it's a stereotype. Is what you're doing. You're stereotyping people. And, the left is very much against that, unless you're stereotyping somebody on the right. Like, you can't fat shame unless you're fat shaming Donald Trump, for instance. If it's something like that. And we're all hypocrites. Everybody's a hypocrite. That's not, we all do it. But but I think that it's just to keep it on point, like, this specifically is, if you didn't agree with this and your kid was going to a school like this and they were saying the opposite, I have a hard time believing that you'd be okay with this. Especially, it's a little different because it's college, but especially if they were a little younger. We could at some point go into that about like high school.
Yeah, but that's the thing. You don't really get that kind of stuff in most high schools. Like maybe in an AP class, but that's a college level class. So you're not really. Here. What? You do what?
Bias like this up here in public school textbooks.
I mean, you get plenty of this right-wing bias in Texas too, in the books as well. So I mean, that's just.
Like what?
Like with the whole slave trade and how it's a good thing, and you'll find that the right does very similar things. So it feels like you're nagging at a point that is it's just the extremities of society. You don't like it, but it happens on both sides.
Do you think though? Because I agree with you. Like maybe we agree because I'm against either of that.
Yeah,
but.
No, I think that's what it is. It's just you're there, you see it more, and you grew up in such a more conservative household, so you see that as how it was, So it doesn't seem like that. What you've learned is necessarily wrong because that's what was given to you. But when you get a broader scope of like someone else who's on the outside giving a different viewpoint, it is wrong and it is an extremist. So, it's like you're leaving your tempered water and you're going out into, you've been told this the whole time, you jump out the water and you're like freezing. So you see this extreme because this is what you've been told and this is how your mindset has been. So I think that's part of what you're seeing.
There's some truth to that for sure. I think about it every day almost about how, people talk about how travel kind of opens your mind. I've noticed being in two places, it's like I feel like I have a different view on things than a lot of people that just remain in one place. But, there are things that you and I are never going to agree on probably. Yeah. But I think that it's just, for me to go back to Eric's point, I think it's, just stereotyping a whole group of people is what I have an issue with. And whether or not, because we could go back and forth about, well, they do this over there, they do this over here. Mm-hmm. But my thing is just, to put it very simply, I don't think it's helpful. I don't think you're progressing society forward by saying a whole, giant chunk. I'm not going to say half, but a whole giant chunk of the American, the American voters.
Brian, do you think that I guess some of like this like liberal stuff that people have been concerned about? Do you think that's more of a fringe thing, or more of like represents the Democratic Party at this point? No wrong answer.
Say that again.
Can you give them some examples?
I almost kind of forgot what I just said, actually. Do you think that an example being of like the trans carving kids up, or like in the case of like this document, and just like using like I guess divisive language, you could say, to really push like a liberal point? Because I guess I thought you were saying that this is kind of like, well, this is what some people are saying. It's a left version of a right, extreme. So do you think that this left extreme that David's kind of talking about, do you think that's more of a fringe thing or more representative of the left?
I I think it's more a French thing because I can see it on both sides. Well, I was gonna go. Something that brings it up to me is, growing up north, learning about the Civil War. I learned all this stuff in Ohio, and then when I never heard of the war of the Northern aggression until I came to the South, sure. And how the wars are looked at completely different. So, yeah. I mean, that's just something you're gonna naturally it's gonna happen within it's like nature versus nurture. I kind of been away.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, I think that is a good point. I mean, I've had people. I had an ex-girlfriend that was talking to me about how in Britain, how they look at the Revolutionary War a little different. Mm-hmm. And it's something Eric actually, this is an excuse to ask you this, but we don't have to go on it. But Eric had this idea years ago about getting a world map from the perspective of Australia. Mm-hmm. And I've tried to find that. I can't, but I thought that was kind of a genius thought. And it's just a way to look at it on your wall and go, okay.
Yeah, get a word. No, yeah, right. Because you see it. Because we always have it like the America and the it's on the left side, and if you go over to Europe, it's like it's the opposite. Like it's all where it's from, or better yet, get one from New Zealand because New Zealand is constantly not on maps. It's consistently not on maps. They forget about it.
So I think
it's upside down. Like I got that idea because there's an episode of The West Wing where I forget what they call it, but they say one day out of the year they basically allow these lobbyists for all the weird stuff that no one really gets a chance to. So for one day of the year, they let these lobbyists come in and talk about whatever their point is. And one of the lobby groups was about changing the maps. And they were showing different perspectives of just like how the map is and how you notice that mm-hmm. Iceland is the same size as Africa.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
which is ridiculous. It's nowhere close.
And Africa's huge.
Exactly. So kind of they argue it gives a perspective as far as who has the value, right? The mm-hmm. ones that are on top and the ones that are larger. Being North America and Europe are bigger on the map than Asia and then Africa, so those are kind of smaller. So they said they showed versions of where you could be bigger and smaller, and then they had one that made me laugh because the map was totally upside down, and the character is just like, "Why'd you do that?" And it's just like, "Well, why not? There's no rules in the map making." She's like, "Well, stop! It's freaking me out." And I think that's kind of the idea, right? Because it goes against just what you think the world is ultimately. As I watched
mm-hmm.
C-SPAN's doing a thing right now where they're going through books that shaped America, and they just did one on common sense, and the guy that was talking was actually from England, and he was talking about that same thing where he didn't really learn about
Thomas Paine, Common Sense?
Yeah, Thomas Paine, yeah. He's talking about how they don't really learn about the American Revolution because that wasn't a revolution for them, right? They lost that. What they mainly talk about in England is about World War II and how awesome they were and how much they did in World War II. That's their focus over there, opposed to obviously here our focus is we fucking did it, we gained independence, right? So that's a good point.
I think that this kind of actually ties all of this up for at least how I've felt is that I get we all have perspectives and you're going to come at it there's people in the South that I've never actually met somebody that says this, but I've heard that there are people that are saying the South will rise again, that kind of shit, And
I've heard people say it.
I've definitely seen the Confederate flags and all that. So there definitely is, a bias that you're going to have, and we're all going to have our political differences. I think that's a good thing, frankly. I think I made the point last week that there is something that satisfies human psychology about having the conservative and liberal dynamic, and I think Eric made the good point that it's hitting the gas and pressing the brakes. I think that's a good way to put it. My issue just is I think anytime you're talking about anybody, but specifically when you're talking about people that are fellow citizens, and more specifically in a time like now where I don't know how you can argue that we're not in a cold civil war right now. I mean, it really feels like that.
Mm-hmm.
And all you're doing is throwing fuel to the fire. And, like I said, if this was being, if Ann Coulter got to write a textbook and it said the opposite of this. Or
how do you know she hasn't?
She's written lots of books.
I've read a couple of her books. I mean, she might have, but she. But it's just that's. I think you understand the point I'm making.
Yeah, Brian, real fast. Who is that quote from about will conservatives hold with conservatism or will they hold with democracy?
It is. I believe it's David Frum, which was a speechwriter for George W. Bush.
Frum.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so with that quote, I guess was he saying he was for keeping with conservatism over democracy? Is that what you're saying?
No, he just said, I'll read it again. If conservatives become convinced that they cannot win democratically, they will not abandon conservatism. They will reject democracy. So it's essentially like I was saying, how like the politicians are picking their voters, they're drawing their maps to get people to vote them back in so they can make their rules. So you're not really getting a democracy when you have like the people aren't voting for the politician. It's the politician picking his people. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Because I guess one of the things I was thinking about when you first read that, anyways, was if that were like a left criticism, as far as like the conservatives would drop democracy like a hat, if it meant saving conservatism. And then I was going to make the argument in the sense of just like, well, I think conservative is. They're fighting for democracy just like, Democrats are fighting for democracy. It's the Protestant Catholic thing. It's just like we both believe in God and Jesus. It's just how to get there, ultimately, I think. Mm-hmm. So I think that's, trying to figure out what that means. And that's why I think it is helpful for me anyways, which I saw you shake your head, Brian, so I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are as far as like that. Once again, that textbook saying that everything besides regressives are actually progressive. It's just that one's a little slower versus one's a little faster. Do you think that's like totally wrong, or what are your thoughts on that?
I don't know. I don't think it's totally. I don't know. I kind of say it again. Let me. I was rereading when you said that. I was rereading the thing. Sorry.
Oh, you're good. So yeah, there's this in this book I had is political ideology, and they had this spectrum, and they said basically their argument, anyways, was that only regressives are the true regressives. Actually, conservatives and liberals and progressives are all on the progressive side of that spectrum. It's just that conservatives are slower versus progressives and liberals tend to be a little faster in their move towards progression, because ultimately we're still moving towards progression unless you're regressing.
Oh, that's a hard... I don't know, because a lot of... you see conservative is like keeping what works and not really moving forward.
Traditional.
Yeah, traditional. So maybe it's slow because it's forced upon them, so they have to accept it. Mm-hmm. So maybe... I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't see it.
Go ahead.
No, I don't completely agree with that.
Sure.
I don't think that's a good. I don't know. Yeah, I don't really agree with that.
Mm-hmm. Because I never heard that perspective before, but I did find it interesting. At least in my mind, it made it seem like we were more together, at least anyways, because we were still trying to move forward. It was just, are you going faster or slower? And there's the good George Carlin joke, right? Whereas it's just like when you're on the highway, why is everyone going slower than you is a fucking asshole, and everyone going faster than you is a fucking maniac? And I think that's a really good segue into politics, because if you feel like someone's moving too fast, they're a maniac, and if someone's moving too slow, they're a goddamn asshole. So,
interesting.
I think that I think that when we first started talking about doing this whole thing, I think I said that one of my favorite politicians is I love Ron Paul, but his son to a little bit of a lesser degree, but I still have a lot of respect for Rand Paul. And I shared this story before, but he was attacked while he was mowing his lawn in 2016, I think. It was around the Trump election. And I remember I had Facebook at the time, and the comments were just full of just shitting on him. And I remember this one in particular that got like 1,000 likes. And she said, I'm not for anybody getting physically assaulted, but this guy doesn't want people to have health care, so fuck him. Something, paraphrasing, obviously. And one of the things that made me realize is that I've listened to hours and hours and hours of that guy. I think I listened to him once for 12 hours doing while he was standing on the floor, just halting. And I think the thing is, like, by and large, whether your healthcare is an interesting one to talk about, most people want people to have healthcare. I think you're misrepresenting people when you say that person doesn't want people to have healthcare. It's a question of how do you get there. And I think on most of these issues, that's really the thing. I think that most of us agree, hey, we want people to be safe. We want people to have healthcare. We don't want mass shootings. We want whatever. We want to feel safe in our homes. We want to be able to protect our families. We want to be able to send our kids to good schools. We don't want to get cancer too young. All those things, I think that at the end of the day, we all agree with those. And I think that we kind of lose that a lot. And we tend to think that this person over there, just to use that example, doesn't want you to have health care. And I think that that's a very damaging thing to do. And I'm guilty of it. Everybody's guilty of misrepresenting another person. I mean, I have very choice words for people that are on the far left. I think it's incredibly naive and incredibly dangerous, and it scares the shit out of me, especially for having kids. But
I feel the same about the far right.
I know you do. And by the way, I do too. I mean, I've got.
Oh yeah, I mean, the extremes on any side are always it's scary. So I mean, either which side you extremes are always bad.
I got the far right. Some of the religious stuff scares the shit out of me. Like it sounds like they almost want a theocracy at times. But
oh yeah, that's scary. Scary.
I just think that the thing is that at the end of the day, we're all as cheesy as it sounds, we're all Americans. And I think that we all want the same things. And if we could start from a place of that, I remember very vividly having this thought when I read that about him, that I know that he doesn't want people to not have health care. I know that that's not true. But it's just a question of how do you get there in it. And, I think that there are, people that just want to burn it all down. You see that from January 6th to the fucking Portland riots where they far left wingers, destroyed like $2 million of public and private property in 12 hours. I mean, so
that's certainly.
I think that's a reasonable
between
thing
the
to
difference, say. Right? Is one of the arguments is that if January 6th was on just like a retail street, it potentially would have been the exact same thing as a BLM riot. Just the difference was that it was on the Capitol.
I disagree because they were going there because they were trying to stop an election. You're not going to be on Fifth Avenue. That's a store. This is the government and how the country works. Mm-hmm. So they're going in there to stop the process of the government because they're telling it was stolen from them. Mm-hmm. This is not going on a street like, we don't agree with you, we're going to smash stuff. Like, they're going in to stop to make sure this didn't happen. So I feel like there's more intent where, like, I don't think you could. I don't think that's an like it says, that's a false equivalency of putting those riots to what happened at the Capitol, because
I guess what I in my mind is just I don't know personally if, as everyone was marching towards the Capitol, if they already had in their mind they were gonna break in. I don't know if that was already the mentality or if it was just the mob mentality as they got there. I won't even get into the whole Fed thing because I don't know if that's true. You know what I mean? So I believe it's easier for me to believe that once they got there were, some bad eggs in there that potentially just got people riled up. So,
I mean, you can go back and read statements of all the people who've been found guilty of all this, and you can see what they said and how they're reacting. If they're really like regret what they did, or if they're still kind of doing the same stuff, So, but that's
how many were arrested?
I would have to. I don't know, a lot.
From my own perspective, I'll just be honest, and this might be my own ignorance speaking, But I felt like compared to some of the other stuff, that was very light. The thing that was wildly inappropriate about it was what Brian said, the place where it took place, geographically, like a building that it took place in, that was the fucked up thing about it. But and I heard stories about like zip ties for Nancy Pelosi and all that.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as actual damage went, I mean, I as far as like feeling threatened physically, even though I'm not there, like when the riots were happening after the George Floyd thing, by the way, just for the record, the George Floyd thing was wildly inappropriate, the way that cop behaved. You know, I'm not, that you can't fucking do that. That guy should be in jail, putting your knee on a guy's neck like that. Just the reaction to it was like, holy shit, man. Like, you want to burn this whole fucking place down.
Well, that's, you know, that gets into the deep inner core of people, is that seeing how that property is more important than their lives, and you know, you can rebuild property. You can't bring me back from the dead. So you get this, put you in a you're rocking a hard place, and you know, we're still animals when it comes down to it. So people are going to do what's in their best interest to preserve themselves. And when we get in masses, there is the mob mentality that it's throughout all of history. And I feel like it was a little bit, you know, with that, you're in a city, so it's more condensed, so there are more people around you for things to happen, and it's easier for damages to occur because you're all right there in this epicenter of, you know, the market and where people live. So there's obviously going to be more damage. You know, you're not going to have that would happen like a rural town. You wouldn't have all this damage if people were having an uproar or something like that.
Yeah, that's true. I actually, just a little anecdote. I was working in Deep Ellum around this time, and I've told Eric this a lot. One of the things that I noticed, I have a story from like a few weeks ago too, of where something like this happened, where we had to have masks on to enter a building, right? And it was a ridiculous rule. Like, you have to put a mask on to go into a restaurant. The second you sit down, you can take it off. You know, it was a ridiculous rule, but that was the law. I got in. Thankfully, I had really big guys working with me at the time, but I'm not exaggerating. More times than I can count, I got accused of being a racist for asking somebody to put their mask on. And I had a similar instance happen on my way to work on a Sunday morning. It wasn't a few weeks ago, maybe it was like 2 months ago. And I had never even met this guy. He came up right next to me. And I think that there is something, this goes with the mom mentality. I think that you see things that aren't real when you're told to be pissed off about something. And, you know, I think that's a really dangerous thing. And I think part of it is telling people that they're a victim and the white man wants to keep you down and all that stuff. You know,
well, that's the stochastic terrorism. That's exactly what that is. You're like you're creating an enemy essentially by just building up how awful they are, how bad they are, what it means to your livelihood. That's essentially what's happening.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I mean, it's and I guess just to pull this all back, this goes down to like, hey man, we're all on the same team here, and I don't know. There was an interesting study I guess it should be called a social experiment, where I'll stop talking after this, I promise. They took, I think, 10 women, and they said, hey, we're going to send you on a job interview and just watch how I want you to tell us how you felt it went. But before you go in, I'm going to paint a scar on your face. And I want you to tell us if you think that the scar, these are very beautiful women, I want you to tell us afterwards if you felt like the scar affected your chances of getting that job. So they had a really good makeup artist do this. Before they go into the interview, the makeup artist would go, hey, I need to do some touch-ups. They would remove the scar. Go in. I think it was every time the woman came back, no scar on her face, but felt that the scar was on her face. So she would say, yeah, I could, yeah, clearly they could see. And the point is that when you go into a situation looking for a problem, you're going to find one, even if it's not real.
Oh, yeah, of course. You're becoming, what is it? Like, you're essentially, what's the phrase? Well, I can't think of it. No, not bias. It's like you're gonna like. It's like that old saying, like the Oedipus theory. Like, well,
confirmation bias.
Like you get told something that like, oh, you're gonna kill your parents. Like, well, I need to get away from this. You're creating your own problem, or you're making it happen.
Self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, that's what I was looking at. Essentially, is what that is. Like, if you're going in there looking for something bad, you're going to find something bad. It's just a different way of saying that, I feel like.
Yeah. All those little things, those little psychological.
Yeah.
The more you're aware of those, I think that's healthy. You know, and I think we live in a really chaotic time. But you know, I think just being able to recognize that most people aren't there to hurt you. Most people don't want to get any kind of physical altercation. Most people are terrified of that.
Yeah.
You know. So.
Well, talking about white Christian men, I guess, kind of owning the Congress that you were kind of mentioning earlier, Bryant.
Ew.
I always kind of wonder, like, is it like this idea of like they're the descendants of the founding father mentality? You know, because I mean, I also thought that a lot of the founding fathers weren't even Christian. Like they were.
They're deists.
They were deists. Is that right?
Yeah.
So I guess that's one of my.
Well,
go ahead.
No, a lot of those with the Southern is essentially what they were saying, like the South is going to rise. Like, so after the Civil War and there was a Reconstruction and Lincoln was assassinated.
Brian was a history major, by the way. So,
like it was put in by there's a lot of pro Confederacy still within the government, so they were still with them wanting a lot of things. So you have this idea where these people like the Dixiecrats and everything, they still have this idea of the Confederacy in there, you know, because it's really not that far off. Like the amount of generations between us that happened, I feel like wasn't like there was like a grandson or a great grandson of like Lincoln that was still alive until recently or something. You know, it's like there's people like who've seen this, you know. But so where was I going with that? See, I have this ADHD, man.
White people.
Yeah, white conservatives. Oh, that's a question then too, because then is that maybe?
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was gonna say it's because there's that. I feel like with those Southern conservatives, the push for that and the Confederacy, you know. So you feel like that they're trying to get that back, and it's just that fight, the dichotomy of like the North and the South still there, you know, stuff that never really fully healed, like with those.
Well, I think that's an interesting point, because I feel like most people on the left would argue that it's just, you know, white men in general that are in power, that are, you know, have been doing awful things for generations, and they're still in power doing awful things. I mean, is that maybe... Because if you have these founding fathers that were deists that weren't Christians, so they weren't white Christian men, you know what I mean? They were white men, they were educated, they were deists, you know? So, like, could you make the argument that, you know... as silly as it might sound, like people in the North, white men, were they certainly fighting for different things than white men from the South?
Oh yeah.
Oh, definitely, of course, yeah. That's just a natural part of like you're all like because you're surrounded by what you know, what is your livelihood, and theirs is different because you're so far away. It's just kind of like what me and David are like, how he sees extremes on the left, where here in Texas I'll see like extremes on the right. So it's very much it is what it is, you know. Well, people of different areas.
Yeah, that's why I'm wondering like what the issue is then, like what this movement is, in the sense of like we're trying to overthrow the government from the left, it seems like, and to, you know, remake and rewrite the Constitution, or, you know, you just tear it all down, it seems like, you know. So it's like, what are they really trying to have happen? Because it's clearly not all white men. It's like it's this branch of, you know, potentially Southern conservative men that you know, believe more racist thoughts, but that's not the whole country.
I gotta interject, because you just said something that I feel like would have gone into what we were saying earlier. Bryant, do you feel like what he just said was a blanket statement about people on the left?
I was about to say something about that with like, because how he says trying to destroy, and then you can see on the right where they're like
destroy the
trying
Constitution is
make a theocracy and everything, and you know, their own version of what they think the Constitution is or whatever, you know. So It's just how you interpret that.
I'm sorry, Eric, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
That's okay. So that's the fringe of the left. Then basically is what I'm talking about now.
Yeah,
trying to overthrow. So,
so that's the thing with these media things. They fearmonger. So it's easy to attack that because that's so far away from how you think. So it's easy to make you not like them because it is so far what you think is what is going to happen. Because it's so far away from your ideology. So I think that's what you get with that. They can point out those so far extreme things of this side, and like this is what they all believe. So
okay, I mean,
can I
go ahead?
I felt very uncomfortable asking this question for a long time, but now I don't care. Does it bother either of you that we can just say shit like that we can just say blanket stuff about white people? And I understand that there's the whole, hierarchy of race in this country, but it does rub me a little weird how we are able to say things blanketly about like white men or whatever. And if you ever did that about a different race, or I know, Eric, you have somebody in your family that does this and you're like, what are you doing? Does that bother? I guess I'm asking Brian, do you feel like that's racist at all?
Well, I guess, but everyone, like, if you were into like a certain group, if they're all the same race, they would be talking just like we are, so it's, I don't know. It's, if they're by themselves like that, because you think is it racist for us talking about whites? Well, I don't know.
We don't mean just us, though, Davis. I'm thinking of, like, representatives in the House of Congress, that are minorities that will say stuff as far as just, like, white men and, this and that ultimately. Is that really...
I think that we have a real... Going back to what I was saying a little bit ago, like, we have this real problem finding victimhood at things that aren't real. And... I think I'm really trying to not go down too many rabbit holes here because this could open up several. But like the wage gap, for instance, you can sit there and say that that's sexist, or men and women are attracted to different careers, or maternity leave, things like that. But almost everybody will say that that's sexism. I think that, and I'm sure that there's an element of that. So I'm not saying that there isn't at all, but I think that one of the reasons that there's predominantly white men in government, I think that that's changing. By the way, we had a black president.
We've cured racism. We did it.
I think that
he's only half.
I think it's just going to take time for that to happen. But I don't think it's necessarily. I am not saying racism does not play a part at all. But I don't think it's racism that's keeping it that way. I mean, we don't have any. There's no law saying that you can't run for president or you can't run. I mean, the Republican debates, we have a woman and a Hindu, a fucking Hindu up there. That's pretty wild to me. That there's a Hindu that's fairly popular among Republicans right now, conservatives.
But that's exactly. That's just because it's now like we've progressed as a society. Like before 1920, you would never have thought of a woman up there because they couldn't even vote. So why would? So I mean, it's just. But prior to that, that's what it was. It was always white conservative men, or and so
is that proof of the spectrum then, as far as conservatives being in the progressive side of that spectrum? Is that proof of that?
Well, people forget like Democrats are conservative. They're just closer to the center of conservatism as far as instead of being on the left, whereas like a progressive is more towards the left. So a liberal is still essentially like classical liberalism is a conservative. That's what it means.
Yeah, that's an important point to make. Yeah, I just my point was, I mean, I agree with. Yeah, my point is just that there's not necessarily. I don't believe that there are actively roadblocks for minorities of women to seek positions of power. I think that it exists. I thought he was talking to me.
Oh no, Sarah came in. Sorry.
I just think that it's. I'm sure it plays a role to a certain extent. I mean, I've worked with in Texas in the restaurant business, I've worked with a lot of minorities. I'm the only white guy at the restaurant I work at right now. I've seen people.
And you're the boss, right?
One of them, yeah. That's why they hired me. That's why they hired me, man. They told me that in the interview. But
yeah, it wasn't your skill sets.
Yeah, but I think that I don't think that we're actively keeping people down, but I feel like that's kind of the narrative that's painted. Mm-hmm. Like, just the white men don't want anybody to join their club, for instance, and I don't think that that's the case.
I think, being a product of biases and geography and everything, certainly with us, we're not that old, so, I think that we're obviously post-60s and that movement and everything, so, it could just be a matter of the fact that we are on that train and our peer group, more or less, is more on that, progressive train, opposed to that, we have parents and grandparents that were around during that time, so it could just be a matter of, as people pass on and everything, we're already on that progressive bandwagon as it is.
Can you imagine people from like the early 1900s seeing how we live now and be like, how
I think about that sometimes. Yeah,
so it's really like, definitely your grandparents are going to be like, well, that's not how it was different for me. So you guys are completely far from me. That just, we change. Humans change. That's the one thing you can count on. It's always something's gonna change with us.
Well, it's that Bill Burr joke where he talks about the Duck Dynasty guy that they asked like what he thought about gay rights and stuff like that, and it's just like, what do you think he was gonna say? The guy's like 80 years old. He's from the South. Like, he was clearly gonna have those type of beliefs ultimately. A product of your time, if you will. Which begs the question of like, what product are we? And I think it's one of the arguments too, as far as like we could argue now like the fringe left, as far as like that progressivism is maybe going too far. And that, people being a product of that environment could be a scary thing. But then you just start to sound like, someone's dad when you say stuff like that. So,
well, I kind of feel that kind of is that way, because when we were growing up, because the civil rights movement was like our parents' generation. So you can see these old movies and they're using certain words in there and like, well, that's just how they talk. That's just how they talk. Like, well, you can't say that. And now in like the 90s, going back and like watching these episodes, like we're watching with Michael J. Fox, Spin City, and they're like just how much they rag on like gay people and everything. It's like how much that really wouldn't fly today, but at our time it was okay. We're like, well, you can't. That's just how it was then, And so it goes that way, generation to generation. You see that, so like people think, well, it's not appropriate for today, but like the stuff we watched that our parents watched wasn't appropriate for our time period. So it's kind of how it goes.
Yeah, it's a very strange thing. It's like whenever COVID happened, I remember watching like a movie, and it was probably like Contagion or something, because that's, why not, right, during the beginning of COVID. But there was like scenes where like bunches of people were together. I remember feeling a little like anxious of like seeing those scenes of like New York and just like, people like falling over each other. I was like, fucking stay away from each other. But I think it's like a similar thing. It's that perspective. So like you'll have that where you watch a movie from the 90s and like someone will say something, you're just like, oh shit, like they fucking said that. You're just like, oh wait, that was commonplace, 30 years ago and everything. But it's a weird thing.